Hello and welcome to my Symbiotic Autoethnography channel. I have created this video in response to many requests and queries related to symbiotic approach to an autoethnographic inquiry, which I describe in detail in my book on symbiotic autoethnography. So in this video, I will try to explain what symbiotic autoethnography is and how autoethnographic narrative can be approached through 7 lenses to create a kind of multi-dimensional research methodology. So if you're interested in this topic, please click on the subscribe button, as I'm planning to upload more videos based on your comments and your questions. This might be particularly useful for students on master's and PhD levels, but also perhaps for undergraduate students who have developed interest in autoethnography. I developed interest in autoethnography when working on my doctoral thesis, and in particular I was inspired by one of Lev Tolstoy's greatest novels, War and Peace, where Tolstoy chronicled the French invasion of Russia and the impact of the Napoleonic era on Tsarist society, not through a precise chronological description of historical events, but through the stories told by people from 5 Russian aristocratic families. And it was that exploratory capacity of personal stories that determined my methodological commitments within the research design of my study, and that was about academics' perceptions of educational leadership. So once I considered using autoethnography in my research, I was immediately faced with a vast number of different approaches. And that was both overwhelming and promising at the same time. So if you're interested in autoethnography, you would have heard about evocative approach, analytic, collaborative, critical, and a few more which are probably appearing as we speak. So the first dilemma for me was to decide which autoethnographic approach was most suitable for my study. And that proved almost impossible, as I discovered that my study resonated with so many different features from many different approaches. So the second dilemma for me was related to justifying my approach, considering the criticism of autoethnography that was coming from multiple directions. So as, for example, Kim Atherington noted, a few critics argued that as a methodology, writing about the self is self-indulgent, self-confessional, and narcissistic. Ross also mentioned that it might be considered unprincipled, and it can be considered lazy, literally lazy, and also intellectually lazy. And I wouldn't even dare to read the last 2 because that creates a very strong negative connotation related to autoethnography. So that's why I decided to come up with my own approach, which I called symbiotic autoethnography. And this approach, in my view, synthesizes central aspects from the diversity of existing arguments, creating one adaptable framework that combines key characteristic features of autoethnographic research. The concept of symbiosis here is used here in its broader sense to denote close interdependence and interrelation between its suggested 7 attributes. And we will look at the next slide that actually represent these 7 features. And I will talk about these 7 features in more detail in a minute. So you can see that I have included here political focus, researcher's omnipresence, polyvocality, interpretative analysis, reflexivity, temporality, and evocative storytelling. Now let's have a look at each one of them in a little bit more detail. Now, temporality was probably one of the most complex concepts that I tried to incorporate into symbiotic autoethnography, because time and time-related context, in my view, are central to our understanding of any cultural phenomena. And yet, despite the growing corpus of autoethnographic research, relatively small number of studies, in my view, make the concept of time their investigative focus. In fact, a few autoethnographers seem to neglect altogether the temporal aspect of their experiences, both theoretically and methodologically. So this strikes me as a surprising gap, considering the significance of time in our life occurrences. And so that's why you will see temporality included in my approach as an essential feature of symbiotic autoethnography, and also as a way of theorizing about the dynamic nature of our experiences. So thinking about the Oxford Dictionary definition of temporality as the state of existing within or having some relationship with time, I had to argue that when it comes to autoethnography, this definition sounds incomplete, as autoethnographic temporality includes more than just reference to time, but also incorporates the qualities of being subjective, locational, and what I call evanescent. And I will discuss it further in this presentation. So it is not my intention to offer a precise definition of autoethnographic temporality, as most definitional attempts tend to contain speculative flaws. So hence I propose a loose definition here, where I divide symbiotic temporality as researchers' perceptions of chronological times as experienced across different localities and captured in the moment of writing. So in this sense, symbiotic temporality is almost a snapshot of our temporal recollections of events. So the issue of autoethnographers' subjective perception of time can be seen as inherent and inescapable feature of autoethnographic temporality. To say that autoethnographers only refer to precise chronological units of time in their narrative is an absurdity, as the evidence from wide assortment of autoethnographic studies are really against this positivism claim, and it is quite convincing. So, yet, resigning to complete rejection of chronological time for many autoethnographers would be totally untenable. So, autoethnographic temporality in symbiotic approach serves almost as a middle ground that allows autoethnographers to both anchor their stories within specific chronological times, while also acknowledging and negotiating their subjective experiences of these times. Because our autoethnographic narratives are also have inseparable connection to various socio-cultural localities, as perceived by the researchers at specific temporal points. I also included locality or locational nature of temporality. These localities, however, are different from locations which are associated with specific geographical spaces or settings. So localities in most cases are not defined by any sort of visible boundaries and can only exist sometimes in the imagination of a researcher or their participants. So sometimes the researcher would perceive themselves as tied to static localities that are moving through times, and sometimes they would feel that time is moving through them as integral parts of these localities. So looking at this kind of deliberations, I define autoethnographic temporal locality here as a particular cultural phenomenon under study that is demarcated by commonly acknowledged or illusory boundaries as they appear at the moment of writing. Now, in terms of evanescent nature of autoethnographic temporality, I consider it useful to juxtapose it here to our traditional chronological perceptions of time associated with the notions of past, present, and future as almost ultimate time reference. However, using this structural reference does not harmonize with autoethnographic writing, since our experiences and memories are non-sequential and subject to different interpretations depending on specific locations in certain spaces and times. So in this sense, this past-present becomes another unhelpful dichotomy, as we actually cannot separate our past from our present. Well, if you think about it, indeed, what is our past? Can we point at it? Can we touch it? Is it just our memories of the past? But it cannot be, since our past only exists as our present memories of it. The memories that are experienced now as we look back at our life experiences from this very moment. Thus, engaging with the concept of temporality goes beyond just moving in time between past and present, but rather it's about taking account of and acknowledging our subjective position in relation to chronological events, in our attempt to almost hold them still in the process of writing. So we write our autoethnographic stories looking back at the events that chronologically took place in the past, but what makes us apprehend the idea of the past is the fact that we have present memories of them, or what I call our present past. Because tomorrow we might remember and interpret same events and feelings in a different way. So from this standpoint, autoethnographic temporality is a symbiotic fusion of past, present, and future, which almost denies the neat chronological arrangements of events, feelings, and emotions. So placing these observations in connection to each other enables us to sketch the tensions and that surround any autoethnographic project in relation to the way temporal aspects of the studies are presented and justified. Symbiotic approach suggests making these discussions explicit in your work, highlighting the limits, possibilities of thinking outside or beyond the logic of chronological time towards almost social dimensions of temporal understanding of times as entanglements of times, sites, our experiences, subjects, objects that help us explore the way dominant notions of time allow for specific societal hierarchies and powers to really persist as real. So in this sense, autoethnographic temporality almost decolonizes conventional ways of knowledge production, allowing autoethnographers to cross the boundaries of qualitative inquiry beyond its Eurocentric conventions, locating their subjective experiences in a broader spatio-temporal rhythm of global cultural contexts. So moving on to researchers' omnipresence. This aspect of my autoethnographic praxis has been influenced by Anderson's concept of complete member researcher, a CMR status, what he calls it. So my concept of the researcher's omnipresence in a way contests Anderson's interpretation of researchers' membership as being one of the individuals composing a group who has another cultural identity and goals of documenting and analyzing action, as well as to purposely engaging in it. So Most of our autoethnographic studies cover lengthy periods of our lives where we are members of specific cultural groups. But first, without having an identity of a researcher, and second, not trying to become participant observer. But nevertheless, we are fully embedded in that culture and are part of that culture, and thus, in my view, a complete member of it. The position that I call researchers' omnipresence as a property of being present everywhere at the same time in a form of disrupted multiple selves. Also, the concept of membership seems to indicate a specific time framework that allows the researcher to enter and leave specific cultural setting by almost canceling their membership. My autoethnographic approach involves a permanent omnipresence in different layers of cultural experiences at the same time as my mind struggles to separate myself as an insider from myself as a researcher within any particular context. So moving on to the next equally complex idea of polyvocality. Well, the concept of polyvocality, however, as a methodological and ethical feature of qualitative research is not new. Researchers and theorists such as Bakhtin, Tobin, Anderson, Congergood, and many others all wrote about the issues related to representing multiple voices in researchers' studies. So, leaning on their arguments, I suggest an enhanced interpretation of polyvocality in the context of symbiotic autoethnography as a space for capturing simultaneously complex entanglements of autoethnographers' narratives with the other. Well, other with a capital letter here, because the other includes the characters from researchers' stories, their participants, and our own multiple selves. But throughout our autoethnographic journeys, our fractured segments of self become disturbed, managed, and shaped by the encounters with the multifaceted other. These multiple others form a symbiotic polyvocal narrative where each of the voices has equal significance in representing that mesh of sociocultural connections with the purpose of not what Patty Leather describes as not looking harder or more closely, but of seeing what frames our seeing. And the next one is evocative storytelling. Well, my decision to include evocative storytelling as another aspect of symbiotic autoethnography has been provoked by a number of authors. You probably would have heard about these authors, but undeniably autoethnographic studies have to include evocative stories, since when researchers emphasize the personal, a new kind of theorizing occurs through juxtaposing of emotion, voices, temporality, points of view, enabling us to read, reacting and reflecting with all our senses, as Ellis and Bochner put it. So it is appropriate at this point to emphasize that I do not see evocative storytelling and analytic scrutiny as mutually exclusive, though these two aspects are often presented in contrast, especially in reference to Ellis and Bochner's view and Anderson's work. So I maintain that segregation between evocative and analytic creates really an unhelpful dichotomy, leading to a false assumption that critical analysis is discordant with the emotive text and that emotionally charged narratives are somehow incompatible with analysis. And now we come to the next feature of symbiotic autoethnography, which is interpretative analysis. And as I have mentioned above, I do not support the detachment of evocative writing from analytic work. Thus, I see interpretative analysis as another essential feature here. And I suggest that interpretative analysis in symbiotic approach aims at merging autoethnographic narratives with a sound theoretical basis that is critically interpreted with consideration of the researcher's omnipresence across their spatio-temporal experiences. And as noted by Spry, good autoethnography is not simply a confessional tale of self-renewal, it is a provocative weave of story and theory, also supported by Alan Collinson, as you can see on this slide, and many others. And now we came to political or transformative feature of symbiotic approach, and this aspect of reflexivity and interpretive analysis intertwine closely with this focus of my study to indicate my intention to problematize and politicize autoethnography and move it, as the laureate and Steinbrück said, beyond the world of harmonious social order into a political, radical world. So in this sense, autoethnography and autoethnographic research contributes to a body of work in which radical forms of academic writing destabilize and discard sometimes dominant discursive dichotomies and explore new ways of interrogating established hierarchies and also relations of powers within them. So specifically in symbiotic approach, autoethnographers are expected to problematize representation and identity through a self-disclosure of their experiences of inequality and social injustice. Thus, in symbiotic autoethnography, that unity of political and transformative aspects form an almost conceptual synergy that enables autoethnographers' representation of their experiences as Spry describes as personal, political, and palpable. And finally, we cannot escape writing about autoethnography or writing autoethnography without talking about reflexivity. And I confirm here my appreciation of reflexivity as a tool for engaging in self-conscious introspection guided by a desire to better understand both self and others through examining one's actions and perceptions in reference to and dialogue with those of others. Symbiotic reflexivity entails researchers' consistent and conscious engagement in different forms of reflexive activities as applied to theoretical, methodological, and ethical aspects of their studies. These three components form the basis of symbiotic reflexivity that is defined in this context as the researcher's simultaneous consideration and scrutiny of their own epistemological, methodological, and ethical assumptions in terms of examining both the possible underlying socio-cultural sources of these assumptions and the ways in which they inform the construction of the phenomena under study. So, at the end of this presentation, I would like to mention that I do not expect symbiotic autoethnography to be one single solution to all issues and dilemmas that autoethnographers come across in their research. As Sparks and Smith note, researchers need to adopt the role of connoisseur in order to pass a judgment on different kinds of study in a fair and ethical manner. So I do hope that you are adopting this role when considering symbiotic autoethnography as an approach to your inquiry. So if you want to find out more, please subscribe to this channel and also follow me on Twitter. Please feel free to like, comment, and ask questions related to autoethnography. As I mentioned before, in my next video, I will be answering your questions and also answering questions from my students, as well as you, my audiences. And thank you very much for watching, and good luck to all of you with your autoethnographic research. Goodbye.